Oh yeah, if one person gets it, the whole class is gonna get some little extra. Y'all probably don't remember Salt Bay. Remember that dude that became popular by like sprinkling the salt? All right, you guys, it's for a couple of things while we pass around the sheet with the Saints score. If anybody predicts the score, again, whole class, all or nothing. If one person in class predicts the score of the Saints Chiefs tonight, I'm gonna bestow on the whole class a little extra. I'm gonna have modified office hours this week because I'm going guest speak in Texas at a school in Texas. So Friday, I'm gonna post your lecture. I'm either gonna record it or post a previous lecture on the muscles of the hip. Thursday office hours, I'm gonna send an email, just giving you a heads up. Thursday office hours, Sarah's gonna have office hours in the computer lab. And then Friday will be virtual. If you need to talk to me, let's talk. We need to FaceTime. FaceTime. I'm going to be coming back that Friday. Okay. All right. First thing I want to, any questions? Someone passing around the Saints score? Perfect. So you can't just say 17-20, Saints 17, Chiefs 20, all right? So you can either start a column like at the top, Saints, Chiefs, but you got to say Saints have this much, Chiefs have that much, but you get, you know, a lot of chances. Okay. Any questions? All right, guys, before we go into the hip, I wanted to give you some justifications that I didn't do a very good job of last time. The whole machine, I understand this is a weird machine, not everybody has it, but all this is, remember we talked about the pros and cons of machines versus free weights, right? You know, you consistent moment, you can, all this is a more expensive, more adaptable, consistent moment to this. That's all it is. It's the machine version of this exercise. Now, this exercise, we cannot do a full range of motion because gravity is going to be trying to twist my trunk to the left here, and gravity is going to be trying to twist my trunk to the right there. Like, you know, again, if you tilted this side, it's going to try to do this, and if you tilted the other side, it's going to kind of do that. This machine allows you to reposition it where the external force is trying to make you do the same thing through full range of motion. Or you could start in the middle and make it. Does that make sense? So this is a little weird and a little, but this is just the machine version of this exercise. That was my intent. Okay. All right. Next thing is segue into the hip. Notice, bless you. If we ask what muscles are we using in a crunch, we would say trunk muscles, right? Specifically trunk flexors. No problem. The segue is, well, what's the difference between crunches and full sit-ups? And this class is not, I repeat, it is not a class to say you should do this exercise, you should not do that exercise. Guys, you take your knowledge and you apply it however you want. Athletic trainers might have a different rehab philosophy for young, athletic, motivated athletes than someone who's working with an older person in the therapy clinic. That your art is your art. I'm just here to communicate who's working and how they're working, okay? So in a sit-up, does that make sense that we're not necessarily working trunk muscles for movement isometrically, maybe to keep the trunk fixed, but we're working hip muscles, making the hips flex, allowing the hips to extend. Does that make sense? Because you're having hip motion, you can't get your elbows all the way to your knees just moving your trunk. Your trunk actually doesn't have a lot of motion. We don't want a lot of motion. If our trunk, where's my, guys, if our trunk did this, that would be a bad day for all the nerves and vessels that run out of our trunk. So it's got to give a little bit, but it can't give too much, okay? So does that make sense that like for a crunch, side crunch, all these different crunches, trunk, but when we do full sit-ups, we're incorporating hip muscles because motion is hip flexion, hip extension, extension. Fair? All right, so let's segue to the muscles of the hip. Again, based off of past feedback, we're going to do the PowerPoint visuals first. And then I'll go to the PDF with the circles and the photos, and we'll see how it goes. Why not? Why not? Yeah, you see. Okay, so let's show. So you have these. You know how in the shoulder, you guys have heard of the rotator cuff, right? You have rotator cuff muscles, and they not only rotate, but they're meant to help aid in shoulder stability because your shoulder has a heck of a lot more mobility. Your hip has a lot of stability. So our rotator cuff muscles of our hip aren't necessarily needed as much for stability because you have this big socket, you have this big ligament inside, you have this big, but they're meant to help spin or rotate our hip, like mostly as we transverse pelvic vertebral rotate stuff. So here's a muscle called the obturator internus and externus. So do you see how it pulls in a direction of external rotation? This is a posterior view, right? Oh, I love how they tilted it. So the pubis is in the front, that's your tailbone in the back. So you see how that muscle is literally just pulling in a direction of external rotation? So our obturator internus and our obturator externus. I love how they made the ischium transparent so that you can see how that muscle kind of is running in the little tunnel there. Okay. The gemellus superior and inferiors. The gemelli, obviously superior on top and inferior on the bottom. Remember, muscle function is direction of pull. You see how they pull in the direction of external hip rotation, lateral rotation. You have a square-shaped muscle on your femur, the quadratus femoris or femoris. That's also an external puller. The infamous piriformis. Heard of that muscle before? Notice all the ones I gave you up until this point had very defined horizontal pulls, like their pulls were almost all X, right? The piriformis kind of is our first one that we're kind of getting angled. So the piriformis is going to have multiple functions or pulls at the hip because of its obliquity, because of its angulation. And obviously, when we get into it more proper, we'll talk about why the piriformis is such an important muscle, sciatica and other things. It's just that the sciatic nerve, sometimes in certain people run deep to it. Some people it runs through it. And so we'll get to that, but I wanted again just to show you how it pulls. And hopefully it gives the abduction pull. So that's the external rotation pull. All right, here we go. The abduction pull. Same muscle, but because it runs at an angle, it's going to be pulling horizontally for the external rotation pull and vertically for the abduction. Does that make sense? All the ones before it were more steep, more across. This one does this. So it's posterior, so it's going to pull this way, but it's also lateral crossing. That's why it does this. Is this method helpful to visually see pull? And then we'll pull up the PDF and we'll talk about it more in detail in this. But at least you know you have a reference in case you need to go back to see pull. Then you have these glutes, and it's not just the gluteus maximus, you have gluteus medius and minimus. there's going to be a precedent that we have with our deltoid, where like our deltoid has certain fibers that pull certain way. Upper chest has a direction of pull that's a little different than the rest of the chest. Anterior delt, posterior delt, it's the same precedent, just put in a hip muscle. We're going to have anterior fibers that have certain pulls than the medial fibers. Do you guys remember when we talk about pulleys, how fifth class pulleys is like a muscle that can piggyback over another muscle? So the gluteus medius and minimus are similar. The medius is over the top of the minimus, so it can piggyback on top of it like a pulley that gets some extra units, some extra top. So this is the medius, and then we're going to see the minimus, which is more deep, but it has the same functions. We call muscles that have the same functions at a joint sister muscles. That's a good view. There's the abduction. So like if we were doing, and it doesn't necessarily work for all of them, but it works for this one. If we were doing like abductor exercises, it'd be working concentrically to abduct and then eccentrically to adduct, right? It's the same muscles. So that's why we learn function based off of pull, not based off of a specific motion. And I know it's semantics, but it's important. We don't want to say I'm using an abductor, a gluteus medius to go up, and then an adductor muscle to come down. Because I don't want to say abduction must be these, and the adduction part must be that. Famous gluteus maximus yoink. So do you see how it's crossing posterior, pulling that femur posteriorly? But remember, we can also keep the femur fixed and pull on the pelvis, right? It's the same function. That's why, like, and you guys know this, like if you're doing straight leg deadlifts, you're working your booty. It's whether or not I do this or this, allowing hip flexion, causing hip extension, same muscle. The external rotation pull. How many of you guys, while we're on this topic, or while we're looking at this, how many of you have older siblings? Wow. You know how sometimes the older siblings talk for you, and sometimes it's hard to find your voice because they're always answering for you and telling you what you want and what you need? You're going to learn in therapy that happens in our body. You have this big, powerful gluteus maximus, and all of those smaller intrinsic muscles sometimes don't have a voice because your gluteus maximus is speaking for them. And so those little muscles are like, well, you use me or you lose me, and they start to atrophy. And then there's problems, and then you got to go in and try to recruit and get those little muscles to speak for themselves. What you got?
So even though some systems have the same function as technology, both with interest, which can isolate using CPGs.
We're going to talk about how you can do your best to isolate muscles. Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a little bit of precedent when we did like cervical and trunk. If I know that a muscle has two functions, so let's say our erector spinae. My erector spinae, both of them are extension pulls, but my right is a right lateral, my left is not. So if I want to really highlight the right erector, I want to do a manual muscle test that is not only trying to flex me, but left laterally bend me. So I want to go like at an angle. So sometimes we can do that. Other ways I'm going to teach you is link tension relationships of muscles that cross multiple joints. We haven't been able to do that yet. But once we get into the hip, I'm going to show you that longer is stronger, like a TheraBand. So if I want to decrease the function of a hip muscle that also crosses my knee, I want to put that muscle on slack at the knee. It's why people that want to build up their gluteus maximus do like the bent leg hip stuff, because you put your hamstrings on slack. they're shorter, so therefore they don't pull as much, and you isolate muscles that aren't affected by other joint positions. So we'll definitely get into isolation of muscles. But at the same time, you never want to put all your faith into one muscle in terms of joint stability, right? So that's why we kind of have several, because just in case one miscues, hurt, injured, doesn't fire, we always have kind of backup. What a great question. My favorite muscle, working track and field and cross country, the tensor fasciae latae, TFL. I'm going to teach you how it's an internal rotation puller. This is a good example of, it's really hard to see because it's so steep, but the horizontal pull is more than you think because of trigonometry. So this muscle looks almost all vertical, but the fact that it has an angle means that it has a horizontal component to its pull. There's the hip flexion pull, as it crosses the hip anteriorly. And then here's the hip abduction pull because it crosses the hip laterally. Rectus femoris. This is the muscle, like a lot of times when you strain a hip flexor. We'll talk about the why. This is a great muscle because it has a second-class function at the hip. In other words, it crosses the hip early and inserts way far away. So if you're trying to slow down hip extension, it's a great muscle to put on the brake. And as we know, when you put on the brake, you never take in your car to change the gas. It's always the brake, because that's where the damage is done. It's on the tires, is putting on the brake. So watch, so this would be an example of a muscle that crosses two joints. It has a knee extensor pull. You guys aren't going to need to know that till we go to the knee. And it has a hip flexor pull. So it's a hip flexor knee extensor. Your body knows so much physics. If you were ever doing the leg extension machine and you got to a part where you kind of struggle, your instinct is to want to lean back a little bit to get a little extra. Does that make any kind of sense? Like you're doing it. Your instinct is to lean back a little bit to get a little extra. What's happening is that rectus, hip flexor knee extensor, is like a TheraBand. And if I'm trying to pull it this in and I need to get a little extra, if I stretch the TheraBand on this end, it's going to pull more on that. So that's why your instinct is to lean back a little bit to get a little bit of extra here. So once again, to your question, if I want to emphasize my other knee extensors that don't cross my hip, I want to flex my hip, slack my rectus so that I can emphasize what I'm going to teach you as I've asked. Let me find out. So position is important when we're trying to highlight certain muscles. That one. The longest muscle in the body, the sartorius. When we get into the knee, flexion pull because it crosses the back. The sartorius I love because it's a great example of a muscle that starts in the front, finishes in the front. Your pes anserine is in the front, but it crosses the knee in the back. So therefore, that's why it's a knee flexion pull. Like, whoa, how do you have a muscle that starts in the front and ends in the front, but yet it pulls the knee in the back? So that's how it crosses. Make sense? But right now, let's look at hip. This is how it's a hip flexor because it crosses the hip anteriorly. When we get to the knee, I'm going to show you how it's a knee internal rotator and the knee is flexed. So right now, the emphasis is just on hip pull, okay? The iliopsoas muscle classes. Now, remember we talked about thirds always favor speed and range of motion? Imagine you're trying to sprint to first base, so you're trying to sprint in a race. You want to try to flex that hip as fast as you can, right? That muscle crosses maybe the side. This projector is really awful. But look how that muscle crosses the hip and immediately inserts into the bony prominence we call the lesser trochanter right here. So it crosses here and inserts here. That's like stepping on a darn rake, right? All it has to do is shorten just a little bit and the whole finger is going to fly up. Great when you're trying to move the hip fast. So iliopsoas, I'm going to teach you, is a blending of the iliacus and the psoas major and minor. So this is how it pulls. Pulls in a direction of hip flexion because it crosses the hip in front. KNES, single flexor, adductor. I mean, you can almost just visualize it. If you were coming from the pubis to the femur, you want to pull in, and the pubis is in front of the hip. Pubis is in the front, ischium's in the back. So if it starts on the pubis, it makes sense it would cross anteriorly as it goes to the femur. So again, you may have other classes that make you memorize, and that's great. Geography. But do we really know where a linea aspera is, or a pes serine is, or a function? What does it do? Because all we need to do is see how it crosses. Like, to me, that's so much simpler for purpose of what the distribution of all of our jobs. I can see how that muscle is a hip flexion puller because it crosses the hip in the front. And I can see how that pectineus is an adduction puller because I literally see how it crosses the hip medially on the inside. Done. It doesn't matter if that muscle does a loop-de-loop-de-loop. How does it cross is a function of how does it pull. Do nurses have all of the medicines memorized? That's why you have a physician desk reference. But purpose should be something that we develop and master. The gracilis. Okay, I want to go to hip. So gracilis, look at that. Pulling medially, it makes sense. You just visualize how we want to pull in a direction of adduction. And we'll look at the knee when we get to the knee. But all of these muscles that have hip and knee function can be affected on their length of tension. We can shorten it to make it contribute less, or we can lengthen it to make it contribute more. All this is what's the difference between standing calf raises and seated calf raises? Some of you that already know, it's like, well, one emphasizes the soleus and one emphasizes the gastroc. And I'm like, that's awesome. Why? And this is the why. Gastroc crosses the knee. Soleus doesn't. So when you flex the knee, you take that TheraBand and you shorten it. You put it on slack. It doesn't pull as hard on the other end. So the other muscles have to take up the slack and do more of the work. You extend, you stretch at the knee, it can pull more at the end. Finally, we get to muscles that have function in their names. If you miss these, no sympathy. But I can see how these could also be tricky. The adductor muscles can be responsible for abduction when they're working eccentrically. And they can be responsible for no motion when they're working isometrically. They get their name because of how they pull in the direction of adduction. They're adductors because they're pulling the leg medially. I teach with repetition. Does it make sense why we don't want to say adductors do adduction? Because sometimes that may be the case. Adductors do adduction when they're working concentrically, but the same muscles can do abduction when they're working eccentrically. Or the other example is my adductors aren't working when I do abduction, and my abductors are not working when I do adduction because I don't need them to work here. They would literally slam my feet into my other foot. Yeah. They get their function based off of how they pull, and then we have to determine which group we need for specific exercises or specific purpose. Your body, and this to me is what's elegant and beautiful, your body already knows which muscles to turn on for different exercises. Your body already knows it. I just need to get your mind to communicate what your body already knows. You know darn well you get into an exercise which ones to recruit and how to recruit them. The concentric, the eccentric, the isometric. Don't let me push here. Don't let me push there. Don't let me put. Your body knows who to recruit. I just need to get you to say what your body already inherently knows. Hamstrings. Yoink. Crosses the hip posterior. Worry about the knee when we get to the knee. Semitendous, semimembranous, membranosus, leviosa. For all my Harry Potter geeks out there. Good, leviosa. Right, Monty. And then our biceps. Why are the hamstrings hip extensors? Because they cross the hip in the back. That's the easiest explanation. So all of that is there for your reference, guys. It's there for you to practice. It's there for your reference. Now let's get into the hip is a big class. It's a 5A school of muscles. But it should make sense because we have to do two main things with all these different muscles. Move all of our skyscraper stuff that's on top of them and make sure our skyscraper doesn't fall apart. Because remember, muscles don't just influence motion. They maintain joint stability. You can dislocate your shoulder and still run away from a fire. If you dislocate your hip, you better hope you have friends around to help. Make sense? If you are a list person, awesome. Here's all the information you got to know. Obturator internus is an external rotator. Quadratus femoris, an external rotator. Piriformis, external rotator abductor. I tell you all the functions that you're going to have to know. And then I try to help you see all the functions in one picture. Is it a doozy? Yeah, that's why we start with the neck. And then we go to the trunk. We work our way up. This is the biggest circle you're going to have in the body. The knee is much simpler. The ankle and subtalar is much simpler. Heck, even the shoulder is a little bit simpler. But the hip, you got to maintain stability and you have to produce big, powerful movements to move everything on top of it, okay? So let's not get overwhelmed. Let's try to keep it simple. Bilateral axis. Muscles that cross anterior are going to be flexion pullers. Let me yoink, yoink. Cervical, we only have one of it. Trunk, we only have one of it. Whoa, we got two hips. Okay. But we have this mirror effect where if I'm in a mirror and I do this, my mirror is going to do the polar. It's as if I'm moving both hips at the same time. It's the same muscles on both sides is what I'm trying to say. If I'm trying to external force is trying to do what to my left hip? It's trying to extend me. I need my flexors. The flexors on my left hip are going to be the same muscles as the flexors on my right hip. That makes sense? So all we're doing is we're picking the right side to reference all of our cross-sectional anatomy, because most of you are right-handed. But just know, it's about anterior, posterior, lateral, and medial now. Because the lateral and medial is the side of a side. The right of my right is the exact same structures as the left of my left. They're both lateral. So all we're doing is instead of saying the muscles on the right and the muscles on the left, we're saying the muscles that are lateral and the muscles that are medial. Does that make sense? So anterior crossing muscles are going to be my flexion pulls. Posterior crossing muscles are going to be my extension pullers. Lateral crossing muscles are going to be my abduction pullers, and medial crossing muscles are going to be my abduction. Then I look at my spinners. Lateral rotation. Remember in 310, lateral and external are the same thing? Spin to your right. Hey, right arm, spin laterally. Hey, right arm, spin medially. So external rotation pullers are just lateral rotation pullers. And internal rotation pullers are the same thing as are the same as medial or internal rotation pullers. It's all part of the master plan. I hope I didn't break it. Okay, something new. Not every muscle, you see there's certain groups of muscles that are on the axis themselves, okay? You have a term that I know you guys have used before called sitting the fence. It's you know, you can't make up your mind, so you sit the fence. I'll give you an example. Anytime I ask my wife, I don't know, where would you like to eat? She sits the fence. She's like, I can't decide. Where do you want to eat? So sitting the fence just means, like, let's say, let's use that RF, which represents rectus femoris. Notice the rectus femoris sits anterior to the bilateral axis, but it does not sit lateral nor medial to the anterior posterior axis. It sits the fence. So therefore, it doesn't sit. It crosses the axis. It is literally pulling right on the axis. It's as if the muscle can neither pull this way nor this way because it literally sits the AP axis. So any muscle that you see, like this one, this is on the bilateral axis, these muscles. It's lateral to the hip, but it is neither anterior nor posterior. It's on the axis. That's how we communicate that. The gluteus maximus, posterior, but it's neither lateral nor medial. Semimembranosus, tendinosus, biceps femoris, long head. That whole box is sitting on the fence. It's as if, let's say I had a bowl and it was sitting on the fence. Sure, I have part of the bowl that's medial and part of the bowl that's lateral, but the bowl itself is balancing on the fence. Does that make sense? So these three muscles, I don't say, oh, membranosus is medial. They're all in a box, and that is balancing on the anterior posterior axis. These are extensors only because they sit the fence. I tried to draw them anatomical, like the membranosus is more medial and the biceps femoris lateral, but that doesn't mean it crosses medial or it crosses lateral. And then finally, we have our PE muscles, our physical activity muscles, our rotation, our merry-go-round muscles. Muscles that pull this way are lateral or external rotators. Muscles that pull this way are medial internal rotators. You see these little five, I call them sharpshooters, they're specialists in sports. They may be like a player that whose only job is just to stroke threes. Play D, shoot three. Or they may have a specialist, a pinch runner, right? They may have a specialist. These lateral rotators, if you think about it, are in a bowl, and the bowl is right in the middle of both axes. They're neither anterior or posterior, nor lateral or medial. What they're trying to do is spin and play on the merry-go-round. Does that make sense? I know right now it's like, bruh, no way. But I promise you, the more we practice, the more we see it, you'll be able to recreate that circle, because all it is students sitting in class, front, back, right, left. Some people sit right on the axis where we could say they sit to the right side or left side of class, but if they're right in the middle, they don't sit more into the front or to the back. Some students might sit right in the middle of class, so they sit more in the front or more in the back, but they don't sit more to the right or to the left. And what happens when you have a student that sits right dead in the middle of class? They're neither to the front nor to the back, to the right or to the left. That's all it is. So our hip flexors are going to be pectineus, rectus femoris, sartorius, iliopsoas, tensor fasciae latae. Hip extensors, gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, tendinosus, biceps femoris longi. I'm going to explain how that works. The abductors are going to be these muscles. Piriformis, gluteus medius, and minimus, tensor fasciae latae. Our adduction pullers, gracilis, adductor magnus, longus brevis, pectineus. Our external rotators, gemellus superior, inferior, obturator, externus, internus, protratus femoris, obturator, internus, and externus, and gluteus maximus. Internal rotation pullers, tensor fasciae latae, and the anterior fibers, gluteus medius, and minimus. This will come with time, all right? This will come with time. But I want to break down how the hip circle functions. So these axes, look, bilateral axis separates flexion pullers from extension pullers. The anterior-posterior axis separates abduction pullers from adduction pullers. And our polar axis separates internal rotation pullers from external rotation. So those axes remind us about function based off of how they cross. Okay? Once again, if you do pros and cons of lists, this is where things can get tough. That's a lot. I get it. But no, if you do listings of flexors, extensors, you're going to have a lot of muscles that cross into other groups because they have combinational pulls. So in other words, you may have a muscle on the flexor that's an agonist with another muscle, but it's an antagonist in another group with a different muscle. So you're going to have a lot of cross-contamination when you do that. As long as you get it right, Misa don't care. The circle approach is a way to learn one picture with multiple functions. Make sense? Boom, 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 and boom. You see that? Boom, boom, boom. Stop it. Let's do this. Yoink. Who am I working? I like how some people have different approaches. Some people will stop halfway, press pause. Some people will say, well, at the start, nothing's trying to make me flex, so I have to use flexors concentrically. Some people may get to the end of your first movement and say, okay, well, now what's the external force trying to do? Now I can establish concentric, eccentric. Am I working flexors or extensors of my hip in this exercise? Hip flexors. True? Okay. The hip flexors are the muscles that cross anterior. You're either going to learn the list. You could even see the muscles. Like, there's another pros and cons. Some people may visually see the muscles anterior. Just don't get fooled by muscles that might seem to be in the front, but they're not. Or if you're trying to see all these muscles visually, make sure you don't forget a picture. So the circles or the list is just our way of trying to make sure we account for all the major agonists of any given group. That's all. It's a check and balance. Coming up, hip flexors working concentrically and going down, same muscles, just working eccentrically. And then, who are those muscles? You're going to learn to communicate who those muscles are, right? Find where the thing is. Good. So our hip flexors, I'm going to teach you how to learn that, hey, KNES, rectus femoris, sartorius, iliopsoas, tensor fascia lata. I don't expect you to know that today. But we did do that in 310. Who are the groups of muscles? And now what we're doing is say, who are those muscles? Who are in that group? Who's on the team? Who are the major muscles on that team? And that's where I give you creative freedom to do it in your own way. Make sense? All right, how about this? How about this one? Oh, yeah. He starts here. Which hip would be responsible for bringing her back up? Her right hip or her left hip? Right hip. So it makes sense that I'm not saying her left hip extensors aren't working isometrically to help hold that position. It's almost kind of like how you might put your arms out to balance. But in terms of bringing her back up, that left hip has nothing to do with it. She could take that left hip and do the, I don't know, back in my day, the stanky leg or something like that. Is that what it's called? I'm old, man. I have old references. Does it make sense we need right hip muscles? Okay. Gravity, in this case, the dumbbell, her mass, is trying to do what to her right hip? It's trying to flex her. True? So I do process of elimination. I don't need flexion pullers. If the exercise is already trying to flex you, I need extension pullers. Make sense? And if I observe extension, when something's trying to flex me and I'm working extensors, it's got to be concentric. And when I observe flexion, when I'm using extension pullers, that has to be negative work. It has to be eccentric. All this class is about is who are those extension pullers? Once we identified them, once we highlighted who we need, the circle doesn't tell you who you need. The circle just tells you how they pull. You highlight in your head or on your paper, I need extension pullers because I understand why I need the extension pullers. And then it's, who are those major muscles? Gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head. Gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head. Because those are the major muscles that are extension pullers, crossing the back. Okay, once again, this is why I understand why they do it, but it adds to the confusion. Someone may call this exercise a straight leg raise adduction exercise. Or they'll talk about a movement, but really it's two movements, right? Because to do it again, you got to go back. So we have adduction, but we also have to have abduction in order to go back to do another adduction. That makes sense? Identify the agonist. Gravity is trying to ab, so we need muscles that are trying to add. When I observe add, concentric of those muscles. When I observe ab, eccentric of those muscles. Guys, you're not going to use the abductors concentrically or you'd slam your leg into the ground. Maybe that's how you do it. But that's not how rehab or exercises work in these situations. Right? You don't want the person to drop their leg on the ground. So again, the circles don't tell you who's working. The circles don't tell you how they're working. What the circles help us to do is remember all of the muscles that are in that group that we identify. These are going to be the medial crossing muscles. And even if it's on the left leg, the medial pulling muscles on the left are the same muscles as my medial crosses on the right. So even if I give you a left-legged exercise, once you identify the agonist, hey, I need my adduction pullers, you can still reference a right-sided circle to remember those adduction pullers. Because anterior is going to be the same for both. Posterior is going to be the same for both. Medial will be the same for both. But if we tried to learn both circles on both hips, they would be a mirror effect. It would be even more confusing because now the right of the left is different than the left of the right globally, but they're the same local. Does that make sense? So all we have to do is learn one side of circle for function. We're not fiddler crabs. We don't have like one appendage that has different stuff than the other. Same muscles on the left side or the right side. So once you identify that you need adduction pullers, the circles or your list help to remind you who are all those major adduction pullers. Pectineus, adductor magnus, longus, brevitor. Make sense? Now on Wednesday, we're going to go through the muscles like we traditionally did. Okay, guys, here's the iliopsoas. Let's look at where it starts. Let's look at where it finishes. But that's to set the precedent for the more important thing, and that's how it crosses. Oh, here's another way to look at it. Is the spine, oh, I think this hopefully will get home and then I'll let you go. Is the spine more in the front or the back of the body? More in the back, right? Well, our iliopsoas originates on our lumbar spine, which is in the back. Is our lesser trochanter, which is this bony nub back here, that's in the back. So here's a muscle that starts in the back and inserts in the back. But that son of a gun pulls your hip in the front because it crosses in the front to get there. So it's a flexion pull. But if all you do is memorize origin and insertion, you may lose track and you may think it's an extension pull because back to back. Does that make any kind of sense? All right, you guys. Y'all have a great day.